Yep. So I'm interested in gender and disaster primarily because of my experience of the bushfires on Black Saturday in 2009, and particularly at the different ways gender is represented in the different players in the aftermath of disaster. So the hypermasculine emergency services, the more feminine community services, the way men and women interact and take on roles and responsibilities in community, the way government plays out in a very top-down role, and then how it impacted me personally in terms of my relationship with my partner, how I saw domestic violence play out in our street and how we were powerless to change it and powerless even to be able to engage the services that were required to support the families that were struggling with domestic violence. I think I've also become really interested, because of some of the work that I've read subsequently. So, looking at, how men and women make decisions in the aftermath of disaster, how they differentially prepare for disasters, and particularly what I think is apparent is the impact of disasters on women and on, pro-feminist men, and also how the capacity for a disaster's aftermath to send things back to 20 or 30 years, so that people operating in really stereotypical gender roles, so that opportunity for men to be more active in caring roles and the opportunity for women to be more active in non-traditional female roles is lost. And I think the other thing is that women's roles in the aftermath of disaster are undervalued and invisible. So, they've been some of the things that I've observed in the aftermath of disasters.
What are the expectations of the roles of men and women in disaster?
I think at a community level, there's an expectation of shared responsibility, but that hasn't been thought through. So, historically, professionals have taken on most of the roles that are implicit in disaster, and communities really don't participate in any of the planning or any of the preparedness work. So, to get to shared responsibility, which is what's currently being talked about, one of the biggest gaps is shared responsibility. So, that's something that needs to really be worked through. I think there's a whole bunch of historical assumptions about, men being protectors and women being providers, but, we saw an enormous amount of very, very capable women being protectors and, a lot of men being providers as well. So it's great if those kind of stereotypical roles can be collapsed, but more than that, men and women need to be agents in their own recovery in the aftermath of a disaster. So local people need to be involved in terms of paid positions, in terms of part-time positions that they can manage with all of their other community responsibilities, but they need to be given authority and agency, and so there needs to be an authorising environment, and there needs to be the ability for local people to take responsibility. At the moment, the matrix of government and corporates and NGOs, all these hierarchical top-down organisations, they can coordinate with one another, but they can't coordinate with communities because they're constituted differently. So that's a major change that I see that needs to happen in preparedness for disaster and in the aftermath of disaster. There needs to be much more shared understanding of how communities are constituted and how to work well with them, not impose things on them.
So, Daryl, do you have an example of when attention to gender had negative consequences, or indeed when attention to gender had positive outcomes from your own experience?
I think the peer support program was probably one of the best examples where men and women got together to address issues around access to services. So people weren't accessing middle-class, clinic-based psychological cognitive behavioural therapy. There was just no interest in it from a significant sector of the community, yet they still needed some kind of support. So in its stead, we set up a peer support program. So the peer support program was supported by Kildonan Uniting Care, and it was a great example because the overwhelming majority of the people who were trained as peer supporters were women, and it was the benefits of their models were that they were low profile, high trust people. So they had incredible networks within the community, and they were able to support people to, heal some of the trauma that had happened as a consequence of the disaster and some of the pre-existing traumas that were reoccurring. But essentially they were able to do things that clinical professionals from the inner cities couldn't do. They would visit people at night, they would spend long periods of time with them, they would support them to become socially integrated again. So these were really critical roles, and it was community generated, and it was generated largely by women, and it was run largely by women. So it was women's informal networks, their conversational networks that created the ecology of understanding about who was vulnerable and why, and how we could intervene and those kind of things. So that was an incredible example of a largely gender-specific program that supported men and women who were vulnerable.
So just finally, what can you tell us about that intersection of gender and disaster?
The intersection of gender and disaster, for me, I suppose it's been something that's been historically thought of as men's territory. And, you know, men get paid to hold jobs for long periods of time to occasionally respond to a disaster. And so there's obviously with unions, and there's a lot of interest in maintaining the status quo. So, you know, one of the challenges in terms of transforming it is, you know, how do you invite women into that system, but how do you also reward the systems that women are embedded in, where they really have historically made a difference, often invisibly?